People call it pink gold. Potash remains a critical element in global food production. Canada controls the largest reserves and output volume anywhere in the world. Now, that resource is being described as a hidden advantage in the trade conflict with the United States. The situation is already affecting production at one of Saskatchewan's biggest mining operations. Nutrien announced that its Corey mine, located west of Saskatoon, will reduce output levels. Anyone who believes trade wars revolve only around tariffs and political speeches is overlooking the real battleground. The moment Washington attempted to apply pressure on Canada, it stepped directly into a supply dependency so important that one mineral, rarely discussed by the public, suddenly carried the ability to disrupt food prices, farming decisions, and economic stability throughout the United States. That became clear after the Trump administration confirmed a 25% tariff on Canadian imports, including potash. Within only a few days, officials in Washington shifted from certainty to hesitation. The United States Department of Agriculture. Secretary publicly discussed possible exemptions and described the situation as to be determined. On the surface, the language sounded cautious. In reality, it revealed how quickly policymakers understood they were dealing with a supply chain that could not be easily replaced. The concern centers on one figure with major consequences. Canada provides around 80% of all potash used inside the United States, and there is no serious domestic alternative prepared to replace that supply if disruption occurs. The first impact appears immediately in fertilizer pricing. Even a partial interruption creates shockwaves across agricultural markets. CRU projections already indicated that with only a 25% tariff, granular potash prices in the U.S. Midwest were expected to rise by $65 per ton between February and August 2025. That increase was almost double the projected rise in Brazil's competing market during the same period. Those forecasts assumed tariffs would continue while trade still moved forward, not a complete shutdown. That means a full interruption involving more than 7 million tons of Canadian potash each year would likely trigger a price explosion beyond recent fertilizer cycles, driving costs into levels where farmers are no longer adjusting budgets, but facing structural financial pressure. That pressure accelerates rapidly because companies such as Nutrien and Mosaic have already stated that tariff-related expenses would be transferred directly to American farmers. Under a complete cutoff, however, the problem shifts from cost to availability. Even if growers are willing to pay more, the supply simply would not exist in the quantities necessary to support planting seasons across major agricultural regions. The second consequence moves directly into the fields. Potash is not optional and cannot be easily substituted. It is essential for nearly every major crop cultivated in the United States, including corn, wheat, soybeans, cotton, along with large portions of fruit and vegetable production. All of them rely on potassium to maintain yields, strengthen drought resistance, and defend against disease. When supplies become uncertain during planting season, especially in April and May throughout the Midwest, farmers are forced into decisions carrying long-term consequences. They either plant with insufficient nutrients, leading to weaker harvests, or delay planting entirely, disrupting production schedules and reducing yearly output in ways that spread through the entire food supply chain. That leads directly to the third consequence: rising food costs reaching beyond farms and into ordinary households. Previous events already demonstrated how rapidly fertilizer expenses can affect grocery prices, particularly during the 2021 to 2022 global fertilizer crisis. During that period, potash prices climbed by around $400 per ton because of sanctions involving Belarus and supply disruptions connected to Russia and Ukraine. The World Bank documented that surge as a major factor behind food inflation, especially harming lower-income households that spend a larger share of income on food. A Canadian supply interruption would likely produce a faster and more concentrated version of the same situation across North America, where dependence remains significantly higher and replacement options are limited. The fourth pressure point strikes directly at the financial stability of farmers, whose margins are already strained by fluctuating commodity prices and trade disputes affecting exports. Statements from industry leaders, including Nutrien's CEO Ken Seitz, make clear that tariff costs are passed downward. Under supply shortages, though, there is no remaining cushion to absorb the impact. Farmers holding delivery contracts for potash would either face disputes or be pushed into spot markets where prices can rise unpredictably. When input costs increase without matching growth in crop prices, the result becomes a financial squeeze capable of pushing entire sections of the agricultural sector into losses within a single season. The fifth reality exposes a geopolitical complication that deepens the crisis further. The remaining 15 to 25% of U.S. potash supply comes from limited domestic production in locations such as New Mexico and Utah, along with international suppliers, including Russia, Israel, and previously Belarus before the disruptions of 2022. Even at their highest output, these alternative suppliers rarely shipped more than 2 million tons each year into the United States. That amount remains small compared to Canada's steady flow of 7 million tons. Replacing Canadian imports with those sources is not merely a transportation problem. It represents a strategic transition that would pull American agriculture away from a reliable neighboring partner and toward nations where supply chains are shaped by sanctions, political disputes, and unstable export rules. The situation grows more difficult when Russia and Belarus are examined together because both countries control a major share of worldwide potash production. Although the Trump administration removed sanctions from Belarus's state-owned producer Belaruskali in 2025, negotiations connected to a $3 billion mining acquisition involving President Alexander Lukashenko still remain unresolved. That leaves the United States relying on suppliers tied to uncertainty extending beyond pricing and into long-term supply protection. The sixth limitation exists inside the United States itself. Domestic potash production cannot expand fast enough to replace any immediate shortfall because economically viable deposits are geographically restricted and mainly concentrated in areas such as New Mexico and Utah. Even under favorable conditions, building a new potash mine requires between 7 and 10 years from the exploration phase through permits, environmental assessments, construction, and eventual production. The Fertilizer Institute stated clearly that no short-term domestic answer currently exists. Any interruption from Canada therefore creates a shortage that cannot be resolved within one agricultural season or even within several years. That shortage feeds directly into the seventh consequence as global potash markets tighten under pressure. Canada accounts for nearly 1/3 of worldwide exports, shipping more than 22 million tons every year. If even part of that supply is redirected away from the United States, American buyers are forced into international markets where they must compete against major agricultural importers, including China, India, Brazil, and countries throughout Southeast Asia. That growing competition drives prices upward worldwide, creating a chain reaction where a regional trade conflict spreads across international agricultural systems. As these factors begin colliding with one another, the situation evolves from a standard trade disagreement into a complex supply chain crisis, where pricing, availability, geopolitics, and agricultural production become tightly linked together. At that stage, a mineral rarely discussed in public suddenly turns into one of the most strategically valuable resources in North America. And this represents only the first portion of the story. While potash quietly increases pressure on American agriculture, another confrontation is unfolding at the industrial level involving steel and aluminum. The economic effects are equally severe, but developing in a completely different form. That second front becomes impossible to overlook after examining events inside Canada's industrial sector, where Ottawa introduced aggressive financial measures following President Donald Trump's decision to expand tariffs beyond raw materials and include a broader range of steel, aluminum, and copper products. The move intensified pressure on industries that were already operating under strain. In response, the Canadian government launched a $1 billion loan program through the Business Development Bank of Canada. The initiative was designed to keep companies operating by offering financing under favorable conditions for at least the next 3 years. That decision signaled that policymakers were not treating the issue as a temporary disruption, but as a long-term economic challenge requiring sustained support. At the same time, an additional $500 million fund was introduced to help businesses carry out what officials described as strategic pivots. In practical terms, that means shifting production lines, entering new markets, and restructuring operations in order to survive within an environment where reliable access to the U.S. market can no longer be assumed. Industry Minister Melanie Joly stated during the announcement that Canada was not waiting for conditions to improve, but was actively adjusting to a new trade reality. Comments from BDC CEO Isabelle Hudot reinforced the urgency by stressing the importance of keeping steel and aluminum companies functioning and competitive despite growing external pressure. These actions followed earlier measures, including tariffs on selected Chinese steel imports and the creation of a $5 billion strategic response fund. Together, they demonstrate how deeply current trade tensions are affecting Canada's industrial foundation, especially after the United States expanded its Section 232 tariffs to include additional products, such as steel coils and aluminum sheets, that had previously been exempt. That expansion produced immediate consequences for manufacturers, including tool and mold producers, who are now confronting significantly higher border costs. The result is shrinking profit margins and growing pressure on companies to rethink their entire supply chain structure. The uncertainty surrounding these tariffs adds another level of difficulty because even Canadian officials admit they cannot predict how long the current measures will remain active. Melanie Joly stated that the final decisions are being made south of the border, while stressing that Canada intends to keep responding instead of waiting passively. That uncertainty also appears in political reactions. Conservative industry representative Raquel Dancho described the financial assistance programs as short-term patches rather than permanent answers. According to her position, the industry ultimately requires a negotiated trade agreement that completely removes tariffs. Signals coming from Washington, however, suggest that a return to earlier trade conditions remains unlikely. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer indicated that the administration intends to preserve tariffs as part of a wider strategy aimed at protecting domestic industries. He framed the policy as a necessary measure to stop foreign goods produced through overseas labor from entering the U.S. market without financial barriers. That position reflects a broader transformation in trade philosophy, where tariffs are no longer viewed as temporary instruments, but as permanent elements of economic policy. The real effects of that transition become visible in industry statistics, particularly inside Canada. Most Canadian steel exports traditionally moved into the United States, but Statistics Canada reported that export values have now fallen to roughly one-third of the levels recorded before Donald Trump returned to office and these protectionist measures were implemented. That decline translated directly into layoffs and operational reductions, including job cuts at companies such as Algoma Steel and Sault Ste. Marie, where hundreds of workers have been affected as demand weakens and expenses increase. At the same time, the expected benefits inside the United States have been smaller than anticipated. Data from the World Steel Association showed that American steel production rose by only 3% in 2025, despite the tariffs, suggesting the policy produced limited gains in boosting domestic output. Meanwhile, research from the U.S. Tax Foundation estimated that Section 232 tariffs resulted in the equivalent of 154,000 lost jobs throughout the U.S. economy, demonstrating how protectionist measures can create unintended damage in sectors dependent on imported materials. When this industrial situation is placed beside the potash issue, a larger pattern starts to appear. Trade policies designed to strengthen domestic industries instead reveal deeper dependencies and weaknesses hidden inside interconnected supply chains. Whether it is agriculture relying on Canadian minerals or manufacturing struggling under rising input costs, Canada in both situations holds significant leverage, either through resources that are difficult to replace or through its ability to redirect industries toward alternative markets. That flexibility may shape the long-term outcome of these tensions, especially as Canada continues investing in expanded resource capacity, including projects like BHP's Jansen mine in Saskatchewan. That project is expected to increase national potash production capacity by 40% before 2029, adding even greater volume that can be directed toward buyers across Asia and Europe. Every new agreement signed outside the United States gradually reduces Canada's dependence on its southern neighbor, while increasing competition facing American buyers who may already be dealing with limited supply options. The same dynamic applies to steel and aluminum. Companies forced to move away from U.S. markets may develop stronger commercial ties elsewhere, potentially creating a lasting shift in trade flows that survives beyond the current political climate. Once supply chains are redirected and long-term contracts are established, reversing those systems becomes difficult. That means decisions made during this period could reshape North American trade relationships for many years ahead. As these developments connect together, the story becomes less about one isolated dispute and more about a broader restructuring of economic relationships, where resources, industries, and government policies intersect in ways that create consequences far beyond their original purpose. The belief that one country can pressure another without serious repercussions begins to weaken once critical dependencies are exposed. In this situation, both agriculture and industry demonstrate how interconnected and fragile modern supply chains truly are. And that raises a larger question without an easy answer. If a single resource like potash can pressure an entire agricultural system, and tariffs can disrupt industrial sectors across borders, then how many other hidden dependencies remain quietly in the background, waiting to become the next leverage point in future trade conflicts? When examining the full situation, the question becomes whether the United States underestimated how dependent it really is on Canadian resources. It also raises another issue. Are these trade policies strengthening the economy or quietly creating new vulnerabilities that may eventually backfire over the long term? Because this is no longer only about potash or steel. It is about how global power actually functions in a world where supply chains increasingly determine outcomes more than politics itself. If you want more deep analysis like this, examining the forces behind major global developments, stay connected and share which topic should be explored next. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.